Picture this. Outside the window, a black Alpine night. Not just any night, but one where the wind sounds like a distant organ and the snow muffles the world into cottony silence. In the late 19th century, a winter train across the Alps wasn't postcard romance. It was an endurance test for sleep. Wood instead of metal, thin walls, weak heating, and long stretches where the carriage had time to freeze right down to the fittings. And before we keep going, write in the comments where you're watching from and how much time you've got. 10 minutes or a full hour to drift off calmly to this story. Winter routes through the Alps took shape gradually, while some passes were still tackled the old way by sleigh and stagecoach. The railway searched for its own way through, sometimes high along the slopes, sometimes under the mountain in a tunnel. When the Mont Cenis Tunnel opened in the early 1870s, then the Gotthard Tunnel in 1882, and later the Arlberg Tunnel in 1884, wintertime Europe felt a new rhythm. Mail, cargo, and passengers could move through snow not for weeks, but on a timetable, though the timetable didn't promise warmth. A carriage back then was often wooden, with little compartment rooms where the doors latched with simple catches, and the partitions would resonate whenever the conductor walked down the corridor. The floor might be plank boards with unavoidable gaps. Cold crept up from below, especially as the train climbed and the oncoming airflow worked like invisible bellows. In those compartments, the cold didn't feel like it was on your skin. It felt like it was inside your clothes, and that made sleep oddly alert, as if your body kept listening the whole time. In winter, the windows became a landscape of their own. Frost would build up on the inside because passengers' warm breath met ice-cold glass. Sometimes the layer was so thick, the outside world vanished, leaving only pale, blurry smudges from platform lamps or moonlight on the snow. Travelers would scratch tiny peepholes into the frost with a fingernail, but a minute later it would cloud over again, as if the carriage itself wanted you to stop looking and finally try to sleep. Heating in those decades was uneven and temperamental. Some trains had small carriage stoves, but the warmth didn't reach every compartment the same way. Elsewhere, the assumption was that the passenger would bring their own personal radiator, a travel blanket, a fur wrap, a wool shawl. Hot water bottles were common too, stone or metal, often copper, heated up and set by your feet. They felt like a small miracle. You weren't heating the whole carriage, you were heating your little island of sleep, and that's exactly why people guarded a hot water bottle like a spare supply of light. At major junction stations, those bottles really were heated in buffet rooms and back offices, where there was a stove, boiling water, coals, life. A passenger would step out onto the platform into the crisp dark, come back with a hot brick tucked under a coat, and lock themselves into the compartment again like in a tiny cabin. But the heat faded faster than you wanted, and then the old methods took over. Pull your legs in, hide your hands inside your sleeves, lie on your side to shrink the surface area that gives warmth away, and suddenly realize that sleep here is almost a craft. The warmest thing was still the person next to you, even if you'd barely exchanged a couple of words. If the train was delayed by snowdrifts and the cars sat in the snow, people instinctively gathered heat inside the compartment, pulled the door tighter, stuffed a scarf into a drafty gap, sat closer. Memoirs from the period often mention the same simple point. In a freezing carriage, silence becomes friendlier, because conversation doesn't warm you the way shared presence does. And in moments like that, you can hear the train's own body living, boards crackling, couplers clinking, metal exhaling. Night stops in the mountains were brief, but unforgettable, because that's when the cold showed itself most sharply. A tiny station, the glow of kerosene or electric lamps, where electrification had already reached the buildings, and the shadows of people looking too large on the snow. Conductors and railway workers hurried. Someone ran with a bucket of coal or a crate. Someone checked axle boxes and brakes. Someone tapped the wheels with a familiar tool, and every strike carried into the carriage like a gentle knock meant to wake you. When the train moved again, sleep tore into pieces on mechanical sounds. The squeal of brakes, dull jolts as the motion changed, the clatter over switches, especially snow-covered ones, where the running gear answered with a short shiver. In the mountains, you also had the wind. It didn't just roar, it went hunting for gaps, caught the edge of a window, and turned it into a whistle. And sometimes it felt like there was another train traveling alongside you, an invisible one made of air and snow. And still, the rhythm of the wheels, like a metronome, pulled your mind back toward half-sleep. Alpine lines taught the railway how to protect the track from winter. In some places, they built galleries and snow sheds so avalanches and drifts wouldn't bury the rails, and the train would slip for a moment into a wooden or stone corridor. Inside that corridor, the sound changed, hollow, enclosed, like the carriage had rolled into a gigantic cupboard. Passengers didn't always grasp the engineering logic, but they felt it in their bodies. Here, the mountains let the train pass, but demand quiet and patience in return. The closer you got to the big tunnels, the stranger the temperature became. Outside, it could be bitterly cold, while deep inside a long passage, the air felt different, damp, heavy, sometimes warmer, sometimes colder, because the humidity changed the sensation. Smoke from the locomotive, where the train still ran on steam, could seep into the cars, mixing with the smell of wet wool and coal, and wrapped up in your layers you'd understand. You weren't sleeping in a room. You were sleeping inside moving weather. That feeling, like the climate changes right on your pillow, kept you awake for one more minute. Mail cars and service compartments lived a parallel life. While passengers tried to warm their fingers, somewhere nearby sacks of letters were being hauled in a hurry, so connections and onward dispatches wouldn't be missed. The railway's winter discipline depended on one thing. Even in a blizzard, the train had to stay a link between valleys and cities. And there was a quiet comfort in that thought. If the letters are still traveling through the night, then you can let your eyes close too. The world hasn't stopped. It's just become colder and slower. And then comes that phase of night when the body stops arguing with the temperature and chooses economy. The blanket settles like a second layer of skin. The hot water bottle by your feet isn't hot anymore, but still honestly gives what warmth it has left. And the frost on the glass starts to look almost beautiful, like someone drawing leafless branches. You no longer listen to every sound. You only register the big ones. A stop, a departure, the long hum inside a tunnel. And if right now in this drowsy haze, the train sways a little harder over a switch, it won't feel like an interruption. It'll feel like the final hint. Let go. Fall deeper to where the Alps stay beyond the window. And that's exactly why it's not scary to listen to them. In winter, an Alpine train worked like a long experiment. How much heat can wood, glass, and human breath hold on to, while the night outside presses in with hard frost? The cars shivered over rail joints, and it felt like the cold didn't enter the compartment all at once, but in small doses, through the floor, through the window frames, through the cracks around the door. And the quieter the conversation became, the more clearly you could hear the train breathing in steam and creaks, promising one more stop somewhere ahead. Heating in the 19th century and early 20th was rarely treated as something you could just count on. On some lines, the train might have stoves. On others, they tried warming the cars with hot water or steam from the locomotive, but it still wasn't even. Passengers learned quickly. Even if there was a source of heat somewhere, it would reach your corner last. So everyone developed their own personal night strategy. If there was a stove in the car, it became the center of an invisible geography. Closer meant drier and warmer, but often stuffier with a coal smell. Farther away felt calmer but colder, and the glass there frosted over faster. In third class and simpler coaches, the warmth was distributed especially harshly. Not comfortable, just bearable. And that word shows up again and again in travel notes, leaving a question hanging in the air. What saved people when it stopped being bearable? The most reliable rescue was whatever you brought with you, because you could build it into layers. Travel blankets, wool shawls, fur wraps, sometimes even an extra coat laid across your knees, turned a seat into something like a nest. Passengers covered not only their shoulders but their heads too, leaving a small gap to breathe, and it looked almost like camping for the night. Except the thing keeping you going wasn't a fire. It was the timetable. Foot warmers played a special role. Stone or metal, often copper, sometimes wrapped in cloth so they wouldn't burn you. They were heated wherever there was fire and boiling water. Buffets, station kitchens, back rooms where staff lived among coal and lamps. A warmer quickly became something you queued for, something you negotiated over. One person got there first, another received one that was already not that hot. And out of that tiny detail, an entire nighttime diplomacy was born. Sometimes people didn't press the warmer right against their socks, but set it slightly to the side so the heat would last longer and not burn out in half an hour. They might wrap it in newspaper or a rag, slide it under the edge of a blanket, and later, when the metal cooled, swap it with a fellow traveler, like sharing the last warm corner. And all of it happened almost in silence, because in a night train, every movement sounded louder than usual, especially when someone nearby was already asleep. Winter sleep in a compartment was rarely smooth, and not only because of the cold. Stops at tiny mountain stations came without warning. The squeal of brakes, a short jolt of couplings, and then a quiet so sharp you could hear the frost snapping outside. Platform doors opened, air rushed in, smelling of snow and smoke, and the conductors hurried down the aisle as if they were racing the car's heat loss. At those stations, you could see the railway at work up close, almost within arm's reach. Dispatchers and conductors might run with buckets of coal and crates, feeding the stoves, making sure the flame didn't die down and didn't flare up too hard. Snow on their boots melted at the threshold, leaving wet marks that an hour later turned into a crust of ice, as if the train were writing its winter chronicle right there on the floor. There was another feeling too. The stove gives warmth, but it brings risk with it. Too much heat could dry the air, and smoke and the smell of coal, especially in wind with leaky vents, would creep into the compartment, mixing with the steam of damp clothes. Passengers learned to air things out the railway way, not for long, but fast, in seconds, so you wouldn't dump the heat you'd managed to store, and that caution made the night feel even more watchful. On mountain lines, there were also stretches where the train slipped under snow galleries and sheds built to protect the track. Inside that corridor, the sound of the wheels changed. It became hollow and rapping, and some passengers, oddly enough, fell asleep more easily there, as if under a white dome. But then the train would roll back out into the wind, and you'd instantly feel that the surrounding cold had never gone anywhere. It had simply been waiting behind the wall. If the route ran through major tunnels, like the ones that linked northern and southern Europe in the second half of the 19th century, sleep took on a strange pulse, Before the entrance, dry, biting cold. Inside, different air, usually more damp. And that dampness could make the cold feel worse, even if the temperature was technically higher. The body didn't react to numbers. It reacted to the feeling of moisture on your collar and in your sleeves. And that's what made you wrap yourself tighter, right before the longest roar. The difference between classes was felt most strongly at night. In more comfortable cars, there were fewer drafts, softer upholstery, sometimes better heating. In simpler ones, the seats were harder, the space tighter, and people slept however they could, wedging a shoulder into a corner. But every class shared one trait. At night, any passenger became equally quiet, because in the cold, you don't want to waste extra breath on words, and that kind of equality sounded surprising. When the train got stuck or crept along because of snow conditions, the compartment began to live by the rules of forced closeness. People sat nearer, shared the edge of a blanket, sometimes simply turned so their backs could hold each other's heat, and it wasn't romance. It was survival, softened into a civilized form. In moments like that, it becomes obvious. Human warmth is the most stable energy source, and it has its own quiet, lulling rhythm. Sleep kept breaking on little things you never notice in daytime. Somewhere a lamp clicked, somewhere a door handle rang. Somewhere in the next compartment a suitcase was shifted, and the sound traveled through the wooden walls, like through the body of a musical instrument. Even the conductor's footsteps in the corridor felt too sharp, and then the wheel clatter returned again, gradually turning wakefulness into a smooth, warm blankness. And still, it was trips like these that made people remember simple home gestures carried onto the road. Someone rolled a scarf into a little pillow under their neck. Someone wrapped gloves in a handkerchief so they wouldn't be icy in the morning. Someone hid a ticket and a watch in an inner pocket, closer to the body, as if warming up order and time themselves. Those small measures didn't cancel the cold, but they gave a feeling of control. And sleep came easier to anyone who managed to build even a tiny home on the seat. And toward morning, the quietest change arrived. The frost on the window began to brighten before dawn, and the compartment grew a little less ink-dark. Someone woke because the foot warmer had gone completely cold, and tried not to move so they wouldn't lose the last crumbs of heat trapped in the folds of the blanket. The train kept stretching through the mountains, and in that slow motion, there was a promise. The next station is closer now, which means you can close your eyes again and sleep through one more warm piece of the journey. A night on an Alpine train sometimes began with deceptive comfort. Platform lanterns, the lively hum of a steam engine, the promise that the road ahead would rock you to sleep all by itself. But as soon as the train rolled out into a dark valley and started climbing, the city's warmth stayed behind, and the carriage turned into a quiet laboratory of cold. That was when passengers first realized the hardest part of the journey wasn't the pass or the tunnel. It was trying to fall asleep while everything around you rustled with frost. By the end of the 19th century, sleeping cars were appearing more and more often on major international routes, and it felt like civilization winning against the night. Narrow compartments with bunks, curtains, and a wash basin promised sleep, just like at home, and a uniformed attendant turned the night into a service. But in the winter Alps, that service came with its own price. Even in a sleeper, you could wake up because the edge of the sheet felt cold, as if it had just been laid out on snow, and that was almost unavoidable. Sleeping cars were usually heated better than standard coaches, sometimes through systems linked to the locomotive, sometimes with their own heat source. But even warmth was still a dream. On climbs, the steam engine worked differently. Stops happened more often, and each time, the air in the corridor changed, as if someone kept opening and closing a door to winter. Passengers learned fast. Real sleep here begins not when you lie down, but when you stop waiting for perfect warmth. And strangely, that could feel calming. The bedding looked neat, but people rarely trusted it completely. Many kept their wool socks on, didn't take off a flannel shirt, and some even stayed in a vest because they knew the cold always finds its moment before dawn. A coat might go on top like an extra blanket, and a shawl could be rolled into a little bolster at the chest so your breath warmed fabric instead of glass. And still, the warmest place often wasn't under the blanket. It was right against your own body. In ordinary seated cars, spending the night required even more improvisation. Some slept sitting up, knees pulled in, pressing a travel bag against them to block the gap below where the draft bit hardest. Others rested their head on a folded coat and used an elbow to build a wall so they wouldn't slide into a neighbor with every jolt. And almost everyone had the same habit. Before closing their eyes, they checked whether the metal foot warmer by their feet had cooled down, because that decided how long you'd sleep without waking. Foot warmers on a night train became something like a pocket campfire, only a disciplined one. People tried not to overheat them so they wouldn't scorch fabric or fill the tight space with the smell of red-hot metal, on top of the usual mix of coal, wool, and steam. And still, plenty of travelers took the risk and asked for one hotter, especially before a long stretch without stops, because they knew what came next. Nothing but mountain wind and the endless knock of wheels that had no mercy. The windows in sleeper compartments were curtained, but the frost still gave itself away as a pale crust along the edges. Sometimes a passenger woke and saw the glass had turned into something like a matte mirror, reflecting only the lamp and the vague shadow of their own face. And then a rare feeling appeared. You're traveling through the highest mountains in Europe, and the outside world seems to have vanished, leaving only a narrow, warm strip inside the carriage. That enclosed feeling could be frightening, but more often it soothed, like a closed front door at home. Sleep broke not only on cold, but on brakes. By the end of the 19th century, automatic braking systems were being adopted more widely on many lines, and trains stopped more confidently. But the sound didn't get gentler. A screech, a short settling of the car, the jingle of small parts, and your body instantly remembered it was in motion. Some passengers learned to fall asleep between brakings, as if catching rare calm intervals, and that turned the night into a game with their own attention. On high sections of track, the wind sometimes hit the side of the car so hard the wooden panels answered with a thin rattle. In those moments, even a thick curtain felt like flimsy protection, and people pulled the blanket higher, almost to their eyes, leaving a slit for air. Breathing grew deeper and slower, not from peace, but from saving heat, like someone protecting a flame in their hands. And that forced slowness, unexpectedly, brought on drowsiness. If the train entered a gallery or snow shed, the sound changed, and many people woke up from that shift alone. The wheels began to drone like they were in a long hallway, where every knock reflects and comes back slightly louder. Then, the drone cut off, and the open wind returned, like someone lifting the lid off a box. Those transitions made the night feel jagged, but they also helped you navigate in sleep. Without opening your eyes, you could tell the train was still climbing. Before big tunnels, the night road could turn damper. Moisture clung to your collar and the edges of the blanket, and it felt as if the cold was no longer outside, but inside the fabric itself. Some passengers preferred not to lie down then, but to sit on the edge of the bunk and wrap themselves up so they wouldn't feel dampness against their back. And almost always the same small habit appeared. Tighten the scarf knot or fasten a button, as if you could button up the night itself. Stops for water and servicing in the mountains were quick and routine, but they shattered sleep more than anything. The platform door opened and icy air blew in, smelling of smoke and fresh snow. In the corridor, you heard footsteps, short commands, metallic clanks. Somewhere they were filling the tender with water, somewhere checking components, somewhere simply rushing so the train wouldn't cool down completely. And half awake, a passenger could feel it. The railway works while you sleep, but sometimes it has to wake you with its work. In those conditions, the sleeping car attendant became the guardian of fragile calm. He might bring an extra blanket, point out where it's warmer, close a door more gently than a tired passenger would. But even he couldn't cancel the main truth. In an Alpine winter, the train belongs not only to people, but to the weather. And the weather has a personality. That's why even the smallest gestures of care were valued on the road. They warmed you almost as much as a foot warmer, and you felt it especially sharply. Sometimes the train slowed to an almost crawling pace, and the wheel rhythm changed, as if someone had knocked a metronome out of time. The knocks grew farther apart, the pauses longer, and that made sleep more anxious. The brain likes being lulled by steadiness, and here the steadiness vanished. In those moments, something simple helped. Count your breaths, listen to the steam engine working somewhere ahead, and imagine that every slow wheel beat is a step toward a warmer valley, even if it's still far away. And yet the night rarely stayed only a struggle. Toward morning, when the tension eases, you suddenly notice you've gotten used to the cold the same way you get used to the rocking. The sheet no longer feels icy, and the frost on the window doesn't irritate you. It simply exists, like the mountains outside. And if you wake for a second in the pre-dawn half-dark, you catch an almost tender sound. The train keeps going, careful and patient, as if promising the next stop won't be just a station, but the return of warmth. The winter Alpine train wasn't only about passengers trying to fall asleep, it was also about mail that had no right to sleep. By the late 19th century, once tunnels began linking northern and southern Europe, mail cars ran along the same routes, with letters sorted on the move under a lamp and the steady knock of wheels. And while someone in a compartment tucked their chin into a shawl, just beyond the next wall, sacks might be shifted around as if the breathing of an entire continent depended on it. Postal services in many countries loved the railway for its predictability. Maybe slower in summer, maybe harder in winter, but along that thread of rails you could still run a communication nerve. Railway post offices operated en route, cars where employees didn't merely transport correspondence, they sorted it by destination, saving hours on transfers. And that created a strange truth. Somewhere nearby, people really were awake all night because it was their job, and their wakefulness almost seemed to prop up your sleep. Mail cars had their own cold physics. Their doors opened more often, to take sacks on at a station, to hand them off, to check seals and paperwork. And every one of those motions let winter in. Metal, paper, damp ropes, and burlap pulled the temperature down fast, and the lamps gave light, but almost no heat. So postal workers did their shifts in heavy clothing and gloves, and paper sometimes felt slightly stiff to the touch, as if it wanted to hide too. When the train entered the mountain zone, stops could become shorter but more frantic. At tiny stations surrounded by nothing but snow and dark slopes, sacks of letters were carried fast, nearly at a run, so the doors wouldn't stay open a second longer than necessary. Sometimes the wind on those platforms was so straight and sharp that the lantern seemed to tremble inside its own halo, and that trembling spread to hands, to sacks, to the discipline of the timetable itself. On nights like this, You really notice that the railway fights a cooling carriage not with one big solution, but with 100 small ones. Conductors tried to keep vestibules shut, avoided opening intercar doors unless they had to, watched the stoves when the train had them, and fed coal in a way that kept the fire steady. But in the mountains, steady is rare. Climb, slow down, stop. And every change in how the train moves changes how fast the car loses heat, leaving you a small mystery for each new minute. Snow sheds and avalanche galleries, built to protect the line from drifts and slides, turned into special sound corridors in winter. The train slid under cover, and instantly, everything sounded different inside the car. The rumble tighter, the knocks deeper, even a whisper seeming closer. For a passenger, it could feel like a rare island of stability. Less side wind under the roof, fewer sharp gusts, and the frost on the glass seemed to stop growing so quickly. But then the train emerged into the open again, and you felt the mountain remind you of itself with a single cold touch. If the train was steam-hauled, the cold sometimes came with another extreme. Damp warmth that appeared suddenly near the locomotive, or wherever steam and smoke found their way through gaps. That mix could make you sleepy, or it could irritate you. It felt warmer, but breathing grew heavier, and sleep turned into a pattern of drifting off and snapping awake. Then passengers did something that feels both funny and deeply human. They pressed a handkerchief to their face to filter the air, lay back down, and hoped the train would exhale it all outside in a few minutes. In winter, delays happened on mountain lines, and they didn't always look like a disaster, more like a quiet pause. The train might stand still while crews cleared the track ahead or checked switches, and in that moment the carriage cooled the fastest because movement disappeared, and with it part of the usual heat balance. Passengers began to conserve, move less, wrap tighter, keep hands closer to the body. And in a motionless train, you hear it most clearly. Somewhere far down the consist, a door slams, as if the sound itself is measuring the temperature. Switches in winter were their own subject for sleep that just couldn't become deep. On snowed-in points, the train sometimes gave a short jolt, not strong, but sharp enough that your body instantly checks reality. Inside the compartment, windows trembled, hardware tinkled, and even if you were almost asleep, your brain made a small note. We're still in the mountains. Don't relax yet. And there was a strange usefulness in it. Each note helped you keep a sense of time, as if you weren't counting night kilometers by numbers, but by jolts. Station buffets in mountain areas weren't just places to eat. They were heat dispensaries. They kept water hot, kept a fire going, and that's where passengers drifted during long stops. Not so much for a drink as for the chance to thaw their fingers for a minute. They could heat a foot warmer there too, turning it into a small ritual. You return to the carriage, not with a purchase, but with a portable sun under your blanket. But a foot warmer always cools faster than its weight seems to promise. And that's the hook that sets up your next awakening. Sometimes people tried to sleep in layers, as if they were putting geography on their own body. First a wool base layer, then a shirt, then a vest, then a coat, and on top a blanket and shawl, together creating the feeling that you're not on a train, but in a camping tent. But in a compartment with thin walls and gaps in the floor, that tent stays imaginary. The cold still finds its way up from below, especially when your legs relax in sleep. Then you wake not from a thought, but from the feeling in your feet. An amazingly accurate alarm clock that never misses by a minute. Passenger density changed the temperature too, though you don't notice it right away. In a full car, the air is warmer but more humid. Breath, wet scarves, steam rising from clothes. and the glass grows thick with frost patterns on the inside. In an empty car, it's drier but colder, and sound feels louder because there's nothing to absorb it. So both crowding and solitude have their own price in a winter train. You're not choosing comfort, you're choosing a kind of night, which starts to sound almost like philosophy. And still, even when sleep keeps tearing, one thing gradually rocks you more than the cold: the predictability of railway work. The conductor passes down the corridor again. Somewhere coal gets shoveled. Somewhere sacks of letters are received. The brakes squeal and release again. There's safety in that repetition because it says, the system holds, people are at their posts, the route is under control, even in a blizzard. And when you catch that rhythm, it becomes easier to close your eyes one more time, with the feeling that the train isn't just moving, it's carrying you carefully through the night. Sometimes the most unforgettable part of an Alpine night didn't happen while the train was moving, but in the silence of a stopped consist, when the wheels quit tapping out their rhythm and you could suddenly hear the cold working on wood and glass. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the winter route through the Alps already knew how to pass under mountains through great tunnels, but on open stretches, it still depended on wind, drifts, and avalanche slopes. And so sleep on the train came with a rare thought. What if tonight we don't make it, and we simply stand here? A snowdrift didn't always look like a white wall. More often it was a gradual heaviness in the run. The train crawls slower and slower, the steam engine pulls harder. There's almost nothing in the windows except murky light and blowing snow dust. And then comes a soft bump, as if the train has pressed its forehead into a pillow. The stop might be brief, minutes, but to a passenger it feels longer than an hour, because with motion goes the illusion of warm inertia. And that's when many people notice for the first time. While standing still, the floor chills you twice as fast, especially at your feet. The railway answered snow not with romance, but with engineering and with people who stepped out into the night. Alpine lines used snowblowers and plows, and in winter there were workers stationed along the route, ready to clear switches and trouble spots by hand. A lantern might appear somewhere nearby, a dark figure in heavy clothing, a few short commands, and it all happened so routinely, as if a blizzard were just another part of the schedule. The passenger saw only fragments of that work and felt the car cooling down slowly, promising one more awakening. Switches and station throats were especially vulnerable. Snow clogged the mechanisms, and ice kept the switch rails from closing tight against the track. That's why on small mountain stations, night stops often came with quick dashes by conductors and station staff, checking, clearing, knocking tools against iron, breathing out steam. Every strike echoed through the car like a quiet alarm clock, and sleep broke into short pieces. But those sounds carried something important. Outside wasn't emptiness. Outside was work, and that was strangely calming. In moments like these, communication depended on the telegraph and strict dispatch discipline, because in the mountains, you can't just try to push through. They reported the delay, waited for confirmation, let opposing trains pass, decided where it was safest to stand if a difficult section lay ahead. A passenger might not know any of this, but felt it through indirect signs. The train wasn't stopped randomly. It was standing as if by some invisible command. And when station lights or signals flickered past the window, the brain took it as a sign of order and tried to fall asleep again. While the train stood, people inevitably switched into heat-saving mode. Blankets were pulled higher, collars turned up, scarves stuffed into drafts by the door, bags placed closer to the feet like an extra wall. Someone might carefully get up to walk a little and get the blood moving, but quickly realized that extra motion means extra exchange of cold air in a small compartment, so it's better to lie still. Sleep started to resemble winter hibernation, only with occasional flashes of wakefulness, as if the train were making you breathe more quietly. During these stops, foot warmers turned into real treasure because they cooled fastest when there was no motion. The stone or copper weight by your feet still held a leftover warmth, but the metal no longer burned. It was simply a little more alive than the air around it. Passengers shifted the warmer's position, moved it closer to the soles, then to the shins, as if rationing the last minutes of heat across a map of the body. And sometimes, someone stepped onto the platform just to try warming it again, only to come back breathing ice, bringing a brief jab of winter into the compartment. Mountain station buffets on nights like these looked almost like shelters, even if they were modest ones. Light, the smell of hot water, a coal stove, a few benches, and people speaking in half voices because in the cold, loud words feel wasteful. You could thaw your fingers around a mug, hold your palms to the heat, and sometimes arrange for a newly heated foot warmer if the staff had time to warm them for passengers. But the strangest feeling came on the way back. You step out of warmth and realize the carriage now feels even colder, as if the comparison itself adds frost. If the delay dragged on, a special, almost camp-like closeness formed inside the compartment. People shared the edge of a blanket, offered a scarf, gave advice on how best to cover the feet, because feet were the first to give up. In those moments, the usual travel distance disappeared. Nobody wanted to waste warmth on chilly politeness, and help became practical and quiet. And then came a pause where the conversation faded on its own, because every word is also an exhale, and you wanted to save your breath. If there were stove heaters in the cars, they became the center of all hope during a standstill, and around them, you could feel an invisible struggle for steady heat. Coal was added carefully so the fire wouldn't be smothered, and so smoke wouldn't roll out, because in a tight space, smoke turns into torment instantly. The conductor might move down the aisle with quick, confident motions, closing doors, checking vents, doing it almost like a ritual, and a passenger, hearing those steps, sometimes fell asleep more easily. If the stove is still alive, the night is still bearable. For now. When the train finally pulled out after a forced stop, you felt it in your body more than in your thoughts. First, a barely noticeable tension, then a short jolt, and the wheels find their rhythm again, like a heart remembering how to beat. The sound in the compartment changed immediately. Creaking gave way to the familiar knock, and the knock began to rock you, as if returning your right to sleep. But along with the relief of motion came another hook. If we've stopped once, won't we stop again in a few kilometers? On mountain lines, winter forced people to build not only tunnels, but whole systems to protect the track. Galleries, snow sheds, reinforced zones on avalanche slopes. A passenger might not know the engineering details, but could feel the difference. Under a shed, the direct side wind disappeared, and for a minute the carriage grew quieter, as if someone had put a lid on it. That little house over the rails gave a brief illusion of safety, and many people slipped into a deeper doze right there. But then the train rolled back out, and the cold returned at once, a reminder of who was in charge. Before the great tunnels, the night could feel especially long, because it was like waiting to cross into another reality. Inside the tunnel, the sound turns continuous and hollow. The air changes, and some passengers woke up from that shift alone, even if they'd been dozing deeply before. Dampness felt different on the skin than frost did, and sometimes it made you pull the blanket tighter over your shoulders, even if, technically, it had become slightly warmer. And when the train emerged from the tunnel, you understood. You crossed a mountain in your sleep, but your body still remembers every change in air. A special trial of the winter route came in the morning hours, when your body has the least warmth, and dawn still offers no help from the sun. The frost on the window grows lighter, but doesn't melt. The floor feels especially cold. The foot warmer has long since become just a heavy object. You wake for a second, hear a distant metallic ring somewhere along the train, and realize the railway wakes before you do. It has to put itself back in order again and again. And there's a strange comfort in that thought. If the train can make it through the night, you can manage to sleep a little longer too. And then comes the quietest moment of the entire winter trip. You stop fighting and start adapting. The blanket becomes a familiar shell, the wheel knock a soothing line, and even the squeal of brakes no longer feels like alarm. It feels like part of a larger mechanical dream. Somewhere ahead, there will be a station where you can warm up. And that certainty settles in beside you like a second blanket. And that's when the cold retreats. Not because there's less of it, but because you've learned to sleep next to it. But what happens when the train climbs even higher? There's a special silence that settles in a carriage once everyone has finally found a position to sleep, while the train still keeps creaking, groaning, living. In that moment, you understand something simple. In winter, what travels through the Alps isn't just a train, but a whole small survival system, where warmth isn't given, it's maintained through effort. And if you listen closely, behind the lullaby of the wheels, you can hear another kind of music, the work of people who don't sleep. The conductor on a night train back then wasn't just a ticket checker, but a keeper of order and temperature. He knew where the draft pulled hardest from below, where a door didn't seal properly, where the glass cried frost faster than the next compartment over. His steps in the corridor sounded steady, almost like a metronome, and passengers often fell asleep to that confidence. Someone is walking the line and watching things, so the night is under control. On mountain lines, winter forced conductors to remember not only the timetable, but physics. The moment a train stops, the cold starts winning, because the movement of air and the familiar, warm friction of carriage life disappears. So it stops. Everything happened faster. Open the door, close it, check, move on, no lingering. And each quick motion sounded inside the compartment like a small click of time, promising another attempt to fall asleep. If the train had stoves, a whole discipline formed around them, like kitchen work, only stricter. You couldn't throw coal in any old way. Too much and the flame chokes. Too little and the heat collapses, leaving the car to cool for hours. The conductor or service staff fed fuel so the fire held steady and smoke didn't spill into the carriage. And that invisible balancing act sometimes decided the fate of the entire night. In cold wooden coaches, you really noticed how heat vanished from below. A plank floor could have gaps, and cold would pull through them as if there weren't a bogey under your feet, but an open gorge. Passengers shoved bags, newspapers, and spare things down by their feet, building a small barricade against the draft. But conductors knew the best method was simpler. Keep the vestibule sealed and don't let air roam through the consist. And that was their quiet craft. At night in the mountains, passengers rarely saw all the station work, but they heard it in the sounds. Metal clanking, short taps on wheels, muffled commands on the platform, all against a wind that seemed to test the carriage for strength. Sometimes you heard the scrape of a shovel across crusted snow, which meant someone was clearing a switch or the approach to the track. and every sound said, "You're not alone in the snow." There are people and routine around you, and routine is soothing. On major international routes by the early 20th century, a culture of service became more visible, especially where sleeping cars of the Compagnie Internationale des Wagons Lits, founded in 1872, were running. But in the Alps, service inevitably collided with reality. Even in a good compartment, the water could be too cold, the air too dry, or in a tunnel, too damp, and the sheet could feel icy to the touch. The attendant could bring an extra blanket, but he couldn't cancel the mountain outside the window, and there was a strange calm in that. On trips like this, small stops at mountain stations mattered more than you'd think. Stations that look as if they've hidden themselves inside the snow. That's where you could see most clearly how cold turns into warmth. Someone hurries with a bucket, someone opens a stove door, and for a second, a dry, hot smell bursts into the corridor. Then it's shut again, and all that remains is a thin sense that the carriage is still alive, not an icebox. And right after moments like that, many people dropped into a deeper doze. But stops are dangerous in another way too. Along with people, cold walks into the carriage. The door opens, and for an instant, air pours in that smells of snow so sharply it's almost drinkable. It settles immediately on the edges of blankets and scarves, and the body tightens fast, like stepping into cold water. Then the door closes, the train moves off, and the passenger tries to gather warmth back around themselves, as if spinning an invisible cocoon. But will it work this time? Alpine lines learned to defend themselves from winter with engineering, and passengers could feel it even without knowing the names of the structures. Snow galleries and sheds covered the track in avalanche zones, and under them, the sound changed. The rumble turned deep and enclosed, and the wind vanished, as if someone had shut a window. For a few seconds, it became easier to breathe and easier to sleep, because there were fewer sharp gusts. But then, the train rolled back into the open, and the draft reminded you it was there, without warning. Tunnels changed the night temperature in their own way, not necessarily warmer, just different. Inside big passages like the Simplon Tunnel, opened in 1906, the air felt more humid, and that humidity could make the cold bite harder against the skin. People woke not from loudness, but from the shift. The rumble turns solid, then disappears, and you can hear the wind singing around the carriage again. Those transitions made sleep move in waves instead of a straight line, and each wave carried you farther. Passengers in cold compartments quickly learned how to sleep without losing heat, and conductors learned how not to break that fragile order. They tried to close doors more softly, step more carefully, dim lamps where possible, because light wakes you more than you expect. Even checking tickets at night could turn into a brief whisper, almost an apology. It was surprising. The strict railway suddenly became very gentle, but only at night, and only in hard frost. There's another side of winter work too. Brakes and safety on descents. In the mountains, braking is especially clear. A squeal, a light shiver, and then a short hush as the carriage seems to settle into its own springs. A passenger wakes for a second and falls back asleep, as if the train itself nudged them so they wouldn't sink too deep. But that sound always carried a thought. A descent is ahead, which means the journey isn't over yet. On some early 20th century lines, like the Lötschberg line, opened in 1913, engineering solutions increasingly hid the hardest part of the climb inside tunnels and galleries. For a passenger, that meant fewer open passes, but more long, dark corridors where sleep becomes strangely dense. You don't see the mountain, but you feel it in air pressure and in the drone. and sometimes that invisible presence lulls you more strongly than any view of snowy slopes. And there was a simple, practical detail: coal and water, without which a steam locomotive and the stoves couldn't keep their rhythm. On night stops, you heard hoses, metal lids, heavy steps, and it all added up to the feeling of a huge working household. The passenger sees only brief flashes of light, but behind them is enormous labor, just so that by morning you'll be in another valley. And the more you sense that labor, the calmer you feel inside, like you're being carried not by wheels, but by care. Inside the compartment, meanwhile, a quiet organization of sleep unfolded. Someone tucked a shawl under their neck. Someone wrapped their head and left a slit to breathe. Someone hugged a bag close to block the cold rising from below. People tried not to toss and turn, because every movement pushes stored warmth out of the folds of fabric, and slowly, the body accepts the rule. Stillness isn't boredom, it's how you stay warm, and that makes sleep deeper, though still sensitive. Sometimes the train hit a stretch where the wind was especially strong, and then even a well-closed frame started to whistle. You hear that thin sound and, half asleep, try to reach the blanket toward the gap, as if you can fix a draft without fully waking. The conductor really will come by later and adjust a door or window. But until then, you listen to the whistle like a lullaby, only made of ice. And strangely, after a few minutes, the brain starts treating the whistle as part of the rhythm, as if it's supposed to be there. Closer to morning, a special state arrives. The cold no longer attacks. It simply exists. Like one more passenger, the frost on the glass grows lighter but doesn't vanish. The floor still pulls from below. The foot warmer has long gone cold, yet sleep becomes calmer. Maybe because the night is nearly done, or maybe because in the dark you've learned every sound the train makes. But that's when a new hook of a thought appears. When dawn finally shows the mountains, will it turn out you've been traveling all this time right along the edge of winter? At night in the Alps, the most unexpected moment didn't happen on an open pass, but right when the mountain swallowed the train. Outside, there was a dry, biting frost that pinched your skin and made the frost on the glass look feathery. Then at the tunnel portal, the air suddenly changed, heavier and more damp, as if winter had switched gloves. You're still holding the warmth of a foot warmer in your hands, but you can already feel it. The carriage is about to turn into a sealed resonator, and sleep will sound different in there. The great Alpine tunnels of the late 19th and early 20th centuries changed the very meaning of winter travel. Mont Cenis opened in the early 1870s. The Gotthard Tunnel opened in 1882. The Simplon Tunnel opened in 1906. These made routes less dependent on high passes, but they added a different reality. Long minutes where it's not snow and stars around you, but stone and echoing roar, and that hollow inside grabs your attention. Before entering a tunnel, the train usually slowed down, and that transition easily woke even people who were almost asleep. The wheel beats grew less frequent. The pauses between them stretched out like someone pulling time like elastic. And then, all at once, a solid wall of sound switched on. Inside a tunnel, everything is heard differently. Even a quiet cough feels loud, and the rustle of a blanket stands out like a footstep. The rocking lull turns into a dense fabric of sound that's hard to fall out of again. The steam era added one more tunnel detail you don't always think about until you feel it in your throat. Smoke and steam could seep into the train, especially if a window or door didn't seal tightly somewhere, and the smell of coal mixed with the damp air. Breathing felt thicker, and passengers instinctively pulled fabric closer to their faces, not only to stay warm, but to breathe more easily. And strangely enough, That muffled breathing sometimes helped you sink into deeper sleep. In wooden coaches, the change showed up immediately in the glass. Outside, the frost held as a dry pattern, but in tunnel dampness, it could come alive differently. Here, it turned clearer. There, it became a wet matte film, and in places, droplets formed and slowly crept downward. A passenger would wake and see not a landscape, but their own breath leaving a trace on the window. And it felt oddly personal. But the trace vanished quickly, leaving one question behind. What is the world outside right now? Warmth changed its character in those minutes too. Damp air often felt colder than dry frost because it clung to fabric and made it feel heavier. A blanket that seemed like a reliable cocoon out in the open could turn cool to the touch in a tunnel, especially along the edge where it met the window or the compartment wall. People pulled it closer, like drawing a boat in toward shore, trying not to give away a single centimeter of heat. And the more carefully you held onto it, the more you wanted to close your eyes and simply not notice anything else. The thin compartment walls worked like a membrane, not for words, but for vibrations. Somewhere next door, a buckle clinked. Somewhere, a door handle turned, and the sound seemed to roll through the car. Even without seeing anyone, you felt other people's presence through air movement and a shared rhythm. Sometimes it irritated you, but more often it calmed you. Someone nearby is awake too, so you're not alone with the mountain. Sleep became collective, like a quiet agreement. At portal stations, life felt especially sharp because two climates met there, mountain frost and tunnel dampness. On the approaches to the Gotthard, for example, there were stations at the north and south portals, like Göschenen and Airolo, and night stops there felt like short flashes of reality. The door opens and dry cold rushes into the compartment, instantly drying out the damp feeling inside. And before you can decide which is better, the door closes again, leaving you with a new portion of silence. Conductors moved through those points faster than usual, as if they knew every extra second with the door open would steal sleep from the whole train later. They might check latches, adjust stove doors if the train had them, and move down the corridor in a way that didn't jostle people for no reason. You could feel practice in their motions. In winter, you can't be slow, or the cold starts running the train instead of the timetable. And hearing those steps, passengers often slipped into a doze simply because they felt someone was holding the system together. Inside, long tunnels came a strange sense of time without landmarks. No posts, no stations, no sharp change of scenery. Your brain loses the usual anchors that keep you alert. All that remains is the roar and a light vibration, almost a perfect lullaby, if not for the dampness and sometimes heavy air. Some passengers slept deepest right there, like in a long, dark room that rocks you on its own. Others, though, woke up from the thought that it's taking too long inside the stone, and that thought clung harder than the cold. If the train stopped near a tunnel because of traffic control or a delay ahead, the cold became the strangest of all. You're still under the mountain, or right beside it. There's less wind around you. But because the train is standing still, the air in the car loses its remaining warmth quickly, and the dampness becomes more obvious. People started shifting, adjusting scarves, checking their feet, and each movement created a new rustle that traveled through the compartment. And the more rustles there were, the clearer it became. Sleep still hadn't won. In those moments, the body reached for simple ways to hold heat that work better than any beautiful words. Feet closer to the warmer farther from the edge, so it doesn't cool against the floor. Hands under the blanket, shoulders deeper into the fabric, head into the scarf so there's a small, breathing pocket. Passengers did it almost automatically, like repeating a familiar ritual. And the most surprising thing is that a few minutes after you set yourself up like this, sleep really does grow heavier, as if you've fastened the night correctly. When the train came out of the tunnel, many people woke from the sudden change in sound, even with their eyes closed. The roar vanished, and the usual wheel knock returned. More airy, with pauses where you could hear wind, the carriage felt as if it had surfaced back into the world. And in that second, your skin recognized dry cold as something familiar, almost convenient. And before you could decide what's better, dampness or frost, the window would frost over again, fresh and fast. On lines like the Simplon, where the tunnel was especially long for its time, passengers often mentioned the monotony. It puts you to sleep, and at the same time makes waking sharper. You can drop out for tens of minutes, and then suddenly snap awake from a small jolt, as if the train has reminded you it's still moving. In moments like that, you don't always know how much time has passed, and for a second, you get startled by your own disorientation. But then, calm returns. The rhythm is back, so you can trust the road again. After a tunnel, the compartment could even feel warmer, not because it actually was warm, but because the damp heaviness in the air was gone. Breathing felt easier, the blanket felt drier, and even the cold from the floor felt more honest, without that sticky edge. You listened to the wheels like a familiar song, and finally allowed yourself to relax. And that's when the next hour's quiet hook appeared. There may be another portal ahead, another roar, and another attempt to fall asleep between the mountain and your own breathing. A winter tourist train in the Alps often began long before the mountains, in the warm hall of a major station, where the air still smelled of coffee and coal, and the departure board showed far-off destinations that promised snow as an event. The late 19th century made winter fashionable for travel. People were drawn to high valleys to treat the lungs, to chase dry frost, to ride in sleighs and ski, and the railway became their road into white silence. But the closer you got to the resort, the colder the coaches became, and sleep turned into preparation. One of Switzerland's strongest winter magnets was Davos, where people went for mountain air and sanatorium culture, especially around the turn of the century. Another was St. Moritz in the Engadin, which had been building its winter season reputation since the 1860s and gradually attracted wealthy guests from all over Europe. These journeys were rarely short. Connections, night stretches, high valleys, and almost always the need to sleep on the way, back when comfort hadn't yet become a habit. By the early 20th century, the route into the Engadin changed noticeably thanks to railway projects that quite literally drew new lines into the mountains. The Albula line of the Rhaetian Railway, opened in 1903, became one of those routes where engineering and scenery travel side by side, yet winter still turned the carriage into a cold box. Bridges, viaducts, spiral tunnels. It sounds like a feast for the eyes, but at night your eyes are shut, and all that remains is the feeling of altitude and the draft under the floor. Tourists on these trains were easy to spot by their luggage and by their textiles. Travel blankets, fur collars, thick shawls, and gloves didn't look like luxuries. They looked like part of the ticket, pulled out immediately, long before fingers went numb. In a compartment, wood gives up heat fast, and thin walls barely hold temperature, so people built their layers early, as if raising a small fortress before the real mountain night arrived. In a seated coach, sleep was usually half sleep, with the habit of waking at every change in rhythm. On climbs, the train worked differently, and the wheel knock stopped being soothing and became alert, as if it were counting stones under the rails. Over switches, especially snowed-in ones, the car gave short jolts, and your head snapped back into reality, only to slide into drowsiness again. That's how people slept, not in one long piece, but in small, warm fragments. The winter interior of a compartment was made of two things: frost and breath. A window thickly patterned from the inside hid the mountains, and that could even help. Less temptation to look, more chance to close your eyes. But breathing made the air more humid, and the frost grew faster, as if the carriage were building itself an icy curtain. Passengers sometimes scratched a small circle to see station lanterns, and immediately watched the circle cloud over again with a white film. Foot warmers were prized on tourist trips, because people often traveled to resorts at night, and at night, the cold feels more insistent. Stone and metal warmers were heated wherever there was fire. Buffets, staff kitchens, station rooms, and a passenger carried one back to the compartment like a treasure. The warmth was local, almost intimate. It didn't save the whole carriage, but it saved your feet, which meant it saved sleep for at least an hour. Sometimes the warmer wasn't pressed right to the socks, but set a little farther away so it cooled more slowly and didn't turn into a cold weight too soon. It was wrapped in cloth, tucked under the edge of a blanket, then shifted carefully, as if you were moving a tiny hearth. On a train, you learn quickly that sleep loves stability. If your feet are warm, the mind clings less to worry, and even the squeal of brakes sounds less like a threat and more like part of the trip. A winter resort route almost always included stops at small stations where the platform looked like a thin strip of light in dark snow. The door opens and cold instantly steps inside, smelling of fresh blizzard, and that smell wakes you more sharply than any voice. Conductors hurry down the corridor. Someone on the platform taps metal with a tool. Someone clears snow around the switches, and you hear it all through the wooden panels as distinctly as if the sounds were inside your compartment. Winter's cold logic was felt even by a passenger who never saw a stove or a firebox. Somewhere along the train, a short, dry smell of coal and hot iron would always drift through, especially after a stop when staff tried to push warmth back into the coaches. But the smell came and went without becoming steady heat, and that produced a familiar feeling. The train is alive, it's trying, but winter is still stronger. And out of that struggle, a strange, soothing fatigue was born. On routes into winter valleys, not only comfort mattered, but timetable reliability too, because the tourist season depended on predictability. Mail, luggage, passengers, connections, everything had to line up, even if snow forced the train to slow. So in one consist, you could have people dreaming of sleep before the resort, and sacks of letters that had to arrive on time. And that mix made the train feel like a small moving city, and a city at night always sounds quiet, but it never goes completely silent. Class differences showed up in winter in a very simple way. Fewer gaps and better upholstery meant deeper sleep. But even in more comfortable compartments, cold found a way through window frames and through the floor, especially as the train climbed. Passengers in expensive cars might get a blanket and softer bedding, but they still slept in wool and kept their hands hidden, because morning cold doesn't care what you paid for your ticket. There's something almost calming in that equality of frost. The closer the train came to high mountain sections and tunnels, the more noticeable the night's temperature drama became. In the open air, the frost is dry and clear. In a tunnel, there's dampness and roar. After the tunnel, winter's dry breath returns. and you feel those shifts on your skin even through clothing. Sleep deepens under the monotone drone, then turns sensitive again on the exit when the wheel sound returns to its familiar pauses. The train rocks you not only with motion, but with changing air. Tourist trains carried people toward hotels, warm lounges, stoves, and breakfasts waiting in the morning, and that thought helped you sleep too. On the road, you often hold on not to present comfort, but to future comfort. A few more hours, and you can thaw your fingers, shed heavy clothes, stop listening for every creak. But Alpine nights like to test patience, so even that expectation sometimes turned into a small worry. Will we make it? Will a blizzard delay us? Will a drift stop us toward dawn? A quiet shift happened in the compartment that you noticed not with your eyes, but with your hearing. Sounds grew a little clearer because the brain had rested enough to separate them without strain. A distant step in the corridor, a brief ring, the soft knock of couplings, and then steady running again. The frost on the window brightened but stayed thick, like a curtain, and that was almost convenient. You didn't need to see the mountains to feel they were there. All that was left was to listen to this rhythm a little longer, because the winter tourist journey had another side ahead. How passengers were met at the cold stations of resort valleys, where sleep had almost won, but frost still had the last word. A train can rock you to sleep even in the cold, but the most treacherous thing in the winter Alps is the arrival, when your sleep has already gone heavy and reality snaps you back with a sharp stop. A brake squeal, a short jolt, and the platform silence feels louder than the whole journey because it's frozen and empty. You haven't even opened your eyes yet, but you already know what's coming. The door will swing wide, and winter will step in like a strict inspector who doesn't bother asking for your ticket. On mountain resort routes, the late 19th and early 20th century slowly trained passengers to accept one idea. The train doesn't bring you to a city, it brings you into a climate. Stations in high valleys were smaller, darker, and colder than grand urban terminals, and yet they worked like seasonal gates. People came here for dry air, snow, and altitude. But at night, those gates look different. A narrow strip of light, and beyond it, a white silence that wakes you faster than coffee. When the train stopped, the first feeling often wasn't joy, but the loss of heat you'd managed to build up. The door opens, and cold air instantly settles on your blanket, your sleeves, your face, like a thin sheet made of ice. The platform smells of snow, smoke, and wood, and sometimes of horses too, because sleigh drop-offs and horse-drawn carriages lingered around resorts for a long time, and while you breathe that in, sleep retreats without fully letting go, leaving you right on the edge of drowsiness. Outside, everything is practical. Lanterns, signs, short commands from railway workers, and the occasional ring of metal that sounds especially sharp at night. Luggage is pulled out fast because you can't keep doors open. The coach will cool down completely, and there's still more running to do, or a return trip to make. Porters and staff move with purpose, and that purpose seems to tell you, you've arrived. But winter doesn't pause here, so you'll have to move right away. If the train arrived before dawn, many passengers found themselves in a familiar situation. Technically, you're already there, but you still need sleep. And that's what makes the station part of the sleep on the road. Waiting rooms at small stations were simpler than in the cities, but they almost always tried to hold on to at least some warmth. A stove, closed doors, heavy curtains to stop drafts. People sat on benches without taking off their coats and tried to doze in the half-light while morning thickened outside the windows. and a new, unexpected tiredness would show up. Sleep in a waiting room feels different from sleep on the train. There's no wheel rhythm, and without it, the brain doesn't immediately understand how to sink deeper. But another rhythm appears instead. The crackle of the stove, the steps of the station attendant, the distant squeak of snow under boots when someone crosses the platform. Blankets and shawls become the main currency again, and suitcases turn into footrests so cold doesn't pull up from below. And the quieter the room gets, the more clearly you can hear the frost working outside, drawing patterns on the glass. Sometimes passengers chose not to stray far from the station's warmth, even if the hotel was practically within reach. At night, a snowy walk feels longer, especially with luggage, and that kind of cold trek can steal the last of your sleepiness and turn it into irritated alertness. So people waited, some for a sleigh, some for a porter, some for the hotel lobby to open. And the waiting became an extension of the trip, just without motion, as if the train were still standing inside you. At resort stations, you could see a special kind of transfer life. The railway handed a person off to the next kind of transport. Sleighs, carriages, and in bigger places, early automobiles. Everything depended on local conditions and the weather. Sleigh runners creaked, horses snorted clouds of steam, and that steam mixed with human breath as if the whole valley were breathing together. And in that moment, you understand why people spoke about a winter resort as a different world. Even the sound of a step changes here. For those traveling to recover in high-altitude sanatoriums, winter added yet another layer to the air regimen. Davos, for example, was famous for a climate culture where fresh cold was treated as a remedy, not an inconvenience. But the trip there, or to similar valleys, still began with something purely human. Warm your hands, protect your throat, don't let your feet freeze on the platform. And when you stand in the night silence and feel cold tightening around your fingers, it becomes clear that the season's romance rests on very down-to-earth things, and that sticks with you. Inside the station, everything looked more modest than the resort ads, and that modesty was oddly soothing. Wooden walls, a timetable on a board, dim light, sometimes the smell of hot water or coal ash, and that feeling of working warmth was surprisingly reliable. Passengers might ask to have a foot warmer heated if staff had time, or simply hold their palms near the stove without talking. And the fewer words there are, the more strongly sleep returns, as if it doesn't like commotion in a new place. For those arriving at night in St. Moritz or the Engadin valleys, altitude made everything sharper, the air drier, the cold cleaner, and the stars, if the sky was clear, seeming closer. But in fog and snowfall, it was the opposite. Space disappeared, and you saw only a lantern's glow and a white veil blocking the distance. In that whiteness, it's easy to lose your sense of scale, so people stayed close to the station light like it was the only point of orientation, and that light seemed to promise, yes, it's cold here, but it's organized. The ride from station to hotel was often short, but it could become the last test of sleep. In a sleigh, the body cools quickly because you sit still, and speed wind strips warmth from the folds of clothing. People wrapped themselves tighter in blankets, pulled their feet in, used luggage as a shield, and remembered their train habits all over again. Don't move unnecessarily, or you'll lose the heat you've trapped. And when the sleigh runners squeak over packed snow, that squeak becomes a new lullaby, just without rails. If the hotel accepted guests late, the lobby was often kept warmer than the corridors. A fireplace, a stove, carpets, heavy doors. But the contrast with the street was so sharp that some people felt not only relief, but a strange weakness, like after coming out of icy water. They dozed there too, in an armchair, on a sofa, waiting for a room, wrapped in their own things. And in that half-sleep, there's a quiet truth of the era. The journey doesn't end at the station. It dissolves into in-between spaces. Night arrivals were a reminder that the railway brought the Alps closer, but didn't make them gentler. Lines like the Albula, opened in 1903, or the Bernina line, which pushed trains even higher in the early 20th century, opened access to valleys that had been far harder to reach in winter before. But along with access came a new kind of fatigue. You can arrive faster, yet you still have to get your sleep. On the train, on a bench, in a sleigh, in a lobby. And that multi-stage night lodges itself in the body more strongly than in the eyes. Morning in the valley often began not with an alarm clock, but with a change in light. It slipped through the waiting room windows or a hotel corridor, and the frost on the glass turned from simply white to slightly blue, like a thin skin of ice. A passenger woke up, and for a second didn't understand where they were. Still the train, or already the destination. Still the road, or already the rest. Then a sound arrived. Not wheels, but footsteps on snow outside. And that sound quietly confirmed. You made it. Sometimes those who arrived too early stepped out onto the platform at dawn and felt how the cold there was somehow truer than the carriage cold. On the train, cold is drafts and cracks. Here it's a single, solid air that simply exists, and it's easier to make peace with it. People breathed carefully so they wouldn't burn their throats, adjusted their collars, and went back inside to the stove, because the habit of warmth beats any pride. And all of it was part of one big sleep hygiene. Don't play the hero. Protect yourself. Even luggage became a participant in sleep at moments like these. People pulled it closer so it wouldn't frost over, leaned on it, used it as a footrest so cold wouldn't rise from the floor. Suitcases and bags became the furniture that wasn't there, and at the same time, a wall against drafts that wooden buildings often lacked. It sounds small, but in a winter night, small things decide everything, because they determine whether you'll wake in 10 minutes or sleep a whole hour, and the calmer you arrange those small things, the closer the next, deeper sleep gets. And then the last subtle shift appears. You start to tell the difference between travel cold and place cold. The first one makes you tense and wakes you up. The second becomes part of the landscape and stops fighting you if you're dressed properly. The railway has brought you into the valley, but now sleep has to move from the train's mechanical rhythm to the human rhythm of a room, a stove, and quiet. And before that switch happens, there's one more question the night likes to ask in a whisper. What was the coldest stretch? The one you've already traveled? Or the one still waiting for you in the next carriage? The winter road across the Alps in the late 19th century often felt like an argument between engineering and weather. The rails were already laid, tunnels already cut, the timetable already written, yet the passenger still wrapped up as if traveling not through Europe, but along the edge of ice. That's why the story of sleep on those trains is also the story of how carriages slowly tried to learn how to hold on to heat, but every improved method immediately met mountain wind, drafts, stops, and damp tunnels, leaving one lingering question. Will the next night be even a little gentler? In the early coaches, warmth was local, like a small campfire in a room. The stove warmed whoever sat close, and those farther away got only hope. Wooden partitions heated slowly and cooled quickly, and on a long climb, it felt as if the carriage leaked warmth outward through every plank. The stove itself demanded attention and discipline, which meant a peaceful sleep depended on whether someone managed to feed it with coal during a stop. and on how many times the door would have to be opened through the night. As international routes expanded, passengers increasingly expected not only speed, but predictable comfort, especially at night. Major companies and state railways looked for ways to spread heat more evenly, so compartments wouldn't feel like a lottery. One person sweating, another freezing. That's how trains began using systems meant to warm not a single point, but an entire space. Steam heating linked to the locomotive, for example. But winter in the mountains quickly proved that evenness on paper and evenness in snow are not the same thing. Steam heating sounded almost like a promise. Steam runs through pipes, radiators warm up, the carriage becomes more unified. In practice, temperature depended on how the train was being worked, on stops, on how long the consist was and how it was assembled, and on how carefully the inter-car connections were maintained. Let the train linger at a station in hard frost, and the system loses some heat, and the passenger feels it as an instant cooling of the air near the floor. Sleep wasn't steady. It pulsed, as if warmth arrived and retreated. Even with better heating, glass remained the weak point, and winter revealed itself fastest on the window. Frost on the inside showed how much warmth was leaking out. The denser the pattern, the stronger the gap between passengers' breath and the cold outside. Curtains made compartments darker and cozier, but they didn't change the fact that the window worked like a cold slab you couldn't lean against. Many people slept turned away from the glass, as if away from a nighttime source of cold that still hovered nearby. The coaches themselves gradually changed too. Wood gave way to sturdier construction. Frames improved, doors sealed tighter, vestibules became better thought out. But in the Alps, tiny details decided everything. A small gap, a weak latch, a crack near the floor that you'd never notice by day could become the reason for 10 awakenings at night. Passengers learned to find those spots with their bodies. Cold creeping along the shin here, a draft under the elbow there, air stirring the blanket near the door. Each discovered draft turned into a small problem you had to solve to sleep. So personal sources of warmth didn't disappear as technology improved. They simply became a normal part of the journey. Travel blankets, fur wraps, thick shawls and wool socks stayed reliable regardless of boilers, coal, and timetables. Foot warmers heated at stations kept saving the lower half of sleep because feet freeze first and wake you first. It was the era's simple logic. Central heating might fail you, but a small warmer by your feet almost never lies. Where sleeping cars ran, comfort became more organized, but winter still found its way inside, and sleep turned into a set of careful habits. A blanket could feel thin, a sheet could feel cold to the touch, and many people lay down without taking off warm clothes so they wouldn't depend on the compartment temperature. A coat or extra travel blanket often became a second layer, a shawl a third, and in the end you slept as if in a portable tent. Except this tent shuddered over switches and braking. And the better the service, the more obvious it became that the main enemy of sleep wasn't the staff, but the climate. By the early 20th century, Switzerland and neighboring countries increasingly discussed and introduced electric traction on certain lines, especially where climbs and tunnels made steam work exhausting. Electricity changed the train's sound and removed some of the smoke, which felt like real relief for breathing in tunnels. But electricity didn't turn a carriage into a warm room overnight, because heat still had to be produced and held, and holding it in a mountain night remained difficult. Passengers noticed the paradox. It became easier to breathe, but it was still not easy to sleep. On electrified sections, the road's lullaby changed. Less harsh steam breathing, a different tone to the hum, steadier pull on climbs. For some, that was a blessing. The noise grew more uniform and put you to sleep faster, like a steady fan in a dark room. For others, the familiar liveliness of the steam engine vanished, and the quiet felt uneasy, especially in snow, where any sound carries. Sleep still depended more on a person's temperament than on the type of locomotive, and that gave the night one more mystery. Humidity in major tunnels remained a special trial, no matter what kind of power was up front. In a tunnel, the air felt heavy, the blanket felt damper, and the cold felt clingier because it stuck to clothing. Passengers woke not from volume, but from a change on the skin, as if someone had quietly swapped the weather inside the compartment. And while the train droned under the mountain, many people did the same thing, pulled the blanket higher and tried to breathe more softly to avoid wasting heat. Stops at small stations stayed the moment when every advance was tested. The door opens, and frost steps in, as if reminding you that all the heating in the world is helpless against a few seconds of an open vestibule. Conductors hurried, shut things, checked latches, shoveled coal where stoves still existed, or kept order where there was centralized heating. To the passenger, it sounded like a short railway performance. Footsteps, metal clank, a door slap, and then the attempt to fall asleep again before the carriage cooled completely. Even lighting affected sleep. Lamps gave a soft glow, but light wakes you, and at night, you want darkness, so curtains, drapes, and the habit of shielding your eyes with a sleeve became part of sleep technique, as important as a foot warmer. In crowded cars, there was extra humidity from breath. In emptier ones, there was more cold and sharper sound. And without meaning to, you chose between two discomforts. The longer the journey went on, the clearer it became. You weren't sleeping in comfort. You were sleeping in compromise. There was also a quieter side of progress. The better a carriage held heat, the more noticeable the small leaks became. Before, the whole coach might be evenly cold, and that felt inevitable. Now, a single draft by the door or a gap by the window felt like a personal injustice. Passengers began repairing the compartment as they rode, pressing a scarf against the frame, placing a suitcase by a gap, wedging fabric under the bottom of the door. And those small, improvised fixes were often what bought you an extra 20 minutes of sleep. Through all this, the railway gradually shaped a culture of night travel. People brought blankets in advance, knew where to ask for a foot warmer, how to settle farther from the door, how not to freeze during a stop. Educating the traveler became almost as important as modernizing the coach, because in the Alps, technology meets habit, and habit often wins. Sleep became a skill you trained trip after trip, remembering where it's usually colder and when breaks most often wake you. And the more precisely you remembered that, the faster you fell asleep, as if you'd signed an agreement with the night in advance. By dawn, even an improved carriage still left you with the same memories. Frost on the glass, cold near the floor, and the feeling that you slept not in a room, but inside moving weather. But another feeling appeared too, as if you'd lived through winter in a gentler form without leaving civilization, and that, by itself, was slightly soothing. The train keeps going, and you argue less with the cold because you know it will stay near you until the first warm station, or until sunlight reaches the valley, and that opens the next night's quiet hook. If the coaches were learning to warm passengers, how were the passengers learning to warm each other? Through words, through silence, and through the shared quiet of a compartment. On a winter Alpine train, the cold was rarely personal. It became shared, like the knock of the wheels, and sleep depended not only on a stove or a foot warmer, but on how well people could share space. In a cramped wooden compartment, every extra breath added humidity. Every vestibule door opened for even a second let stored heat spill out, and even a slightly cracked top vent window could turn the night into a chain of wake-ups. Without noticing, the train taught passengers the hardest skill of travel, living quietly alongside others. Almost everything began with a simple question, asked with the same careful tone in any language. Should I close the window? In Switzerland, where German, French, and Italian meet, requests like that were everyday diplomacy, especially on international trains. One person felt stifled from the stove or from the breath of a packed compartment. Another felt cold even with the glass shut, and the night became a search for the middle. The most interesting part was that people often found the compromise not with words, but with gestures, and sleep was already hiding inside that. In third-class compartments, where benches were tighter and drafts were more obvious, people learned the price of peace faster. There was less personal space, but more warmth from nearby bodies, so passengers sometimes tolerated discomfort for the sake of a shared temperature. Someone stuffed a scarf into the gap by the door, set a bag by their feet as a barrier, spread a blanket so it wouldn't breathe into the aisle with every movement, and suddenly it became clear. Shared warmth isn't held together by closeness, but by coordinated stillness. Blankets and shawls became a kind of unspoken exchange, especially when the train was delayed or stood for a long time at a mountain station. If someone had an extra travel blanket, it might end up on a neighbor's knees simply because otherwise there would be shivering and constant movement all night, and movement steals warmth from everyone. The warm gesture looked ordinary without sentimentality, and that's exactly why it worked so well. Practical care in the cold. In moments like that, the car would grow quieter, as if it were grateful. Foot warmers affected relationships between fellow travelers too, even though they seemed like a strictly personal item. In the French tradition, there was the hot water bottle, and in the German tradition, there were foot warmers and heated bottles, things passengers guarded like a reserve for the night. If one warmer was truly hot, a small sense of fairness appeared around it. Who needs it more? Who's colder? Whose shoes are thinner? Sometimes, a warmer was lent for a few minutes to bring feeling back to numb toes, and that short exchange could buy you another hour of sleep. An unexpected economy of heat. Another source of tension and warmth was food and a hot drink, not always available, but always wanted. During stops, passengers went to the buffet, less for dinner than for a mug of something hot, so warmth could move from the inside outward and stop feeling unreachable. When they came back, they brought the smell of coffee or tea into the compartment, and that smell was strangely calming. It said civilization was close, even if there was a blizzard outside. But it also brought temptation. Open the door again, let in frost again, wake half the car again. Smoking was still common among travelers then, and it was often treated as a way to warm up, even though it usually did the opposite. In a closed compartment, smoke mixed with dampness and the smell of coal made the air heavy and then demanded ventilation, which meant unavoidable cold. So night trains produced one more quiet deal. Someone put up with it. Someone asked the smoker to wait for the vestibule or a station, and everyone tried not to turn it into a loud scene. And when people managed to agree, sleep grew deeper, as if the conflict itself had been an extra source of cold. Different classes created different kinds of night community. In sleeping cars, where service was more organized and quiet rules were stronger, togetherness showed itself more subtly. Fewer conversations, more careful movements, fewer door slams. An attendant could bring an extra blanket, and you felt care as part of the paid order. But even there, you still depended on other people. Someone walked louder in the corridor. Someone dropped something. Someone forgot to close a door. That dependence has its own hook. You can buy comfort, but silence is still shared work. In seated coaches, community was built by bodies and by time. By midnight, most people already knew strangers' habits. One person's leg kept twitching, another snored. Someone constantly adjusted a collar. Someone woke up at every breaking. Irritation often gave way to acceptance, because on the road, acceptance saves energy. And energy is warmth too. That acceptance turned strangers into fellow travelers in the old sense of the word. A temporary brotherhood held together by the night. Women's compartments and family sections found on some lines added another layer to the topic of sleep, safety, and calm. Night travel lulls you better when you aren't tense. So separating passengers by gender or by family groups sometimes felt like a way to reduce anxiety, but the same physical laws still applied. The window, the gap, the frost, the cold floor, the stop at a windy station. You could arrange calm socially, but you still had to arrange the cold with everyday tricks. Those traveling to recover in mountain valleys treated night air especially carefully. In the sanatorium culture of the late 19th century, high-altitude climate was valued, but in a railway car that climate could become too direct. Dampness in a tunnel, sharp cold on the platform, an icy draft at floor level. So in compartments, you could hear very gentle requests. Don't open it for long. Don't air out suddenly. Don't stand with the door to the vestibule open. Those requests didn't sound like fussiness, but like concern for health, which made them hard to argue with, though it still didn't erase how different people are. The language barrier on international trains influenced sleep in a strange way. When you aren't sure you'll be understood, you speak more quietly, more briefly, more carefully, and the compartment slips into silence faster. Sometimes a look and a gesture were enough. Pull the blanket up. Point to a gap by the door. Press the vent window shut with your fingers as if you're fastening the air. The more of those gestures there were, the fewer words followed, which meant less breathing for conversation, and the compartment became a little drier and a little calmer. A small victory. When trains were delayed, togetherness often showed itself in the simplest form. People shared information. Someone heard at the station that crews were clearing the line ahead. Someone noticed an opposing train was held up. Someone saw workers cleaning switches, and those phrases traveled in a whisper, as if even the news had to stay quiet so it wouldn't wake hope. Information calmed people down, because uncertainty keeps you awake more than frost. And as soon as your mind had a plan, we'll stand, then we'll go. Sleep found its way back. A classic winter night scene was when someone in the compartment finally got too cold and had to move, and that movement woke the others. Then came small rearrangements, swap seats to get away from a draft, slide a bag under someone's feet, hand over part of a blanket, help button a collar because fingers won't cooperate. It happened without heroics, but with precision, like a tiny emergency service. And after those interventions, the compartment usually went quiet for a long time, because everyone felt it. Order is restored. Now we can sink again. Even the sound of the train became a collective event, because the same jolts woke everyone at once. Over snowed-in switches, the car gave a short jolt, and you could almost physically feel several people return for a second, and then try to slip back into sleep. In a tunnel, the roar turned continuous, and someone started breathing faster, someone deeper, someone pulled the blanket higher, and those movements, even unseen, created a shared compartment rhythm. Sleep here wasn't individual, it was synchronized by the mechanics of the route. By morning, one surprising thing appeared in any compartment: carefulness with silence. People who had lived through hours of cold and stops began to value each minute of drowsiness like a rare coin. So they tried not to slam doors, not to speak loudly, not to rummage for things in a panic. Even the impatient became gentler on a winter train, because gentleness reduces noise, and noise steals sleep from everyone. It was an unspoken etiquette, never printed in timetables, but it carried the nights. The most soothing feeling on trips like this was realizing that strangers can be your source of warmth without crossing boundaries. You don't have to press close or talk. Sometimes it's enough to close the window in time, not to vent heat into the vestibule, to let your neighbor sleep, to share the edge of a blanket, to give the colder seat to someone who's bundled better. Those small choices added up into one quiet system, where everyone helps everyone simply by behaving well. And right there comes the last hook before the final blocks. If togetherness saved sleep in a compartment, what traces did nights like these leave in letters, diaries, and railway rules that tried to describe cold in official language? A winter train across the Alps in the late 19th century left behind not only rail tracks in the snow, but traces on paper too. Timetables, service instructions, newspaper notes, letters home. People rarely wrote, "I was terribly cold," in pretty language. More often they dryly noted a delay, a connection, the condition of the coaches, how the stoves were working. And that dryness hits harder than any novel. It means the cold was so normal no one dressed it up. They simply lived through it. By the end of the 19th century, the railway already knew how to be proud of its victories. Long tunnels, punctual running, rising passenger numbers. The opening of the Gotthard Tunnel in 1882, or the Simplon in 1906, was seen as a step toward a compressed Europe, where distances shrink. But right alongside that was the everyday layer. Wherever you were heading, at night, you were still hunting for warmth at your feet and trying not to disturb someone else's sleep. The official language of the railways loved order, staff rules, safety standards, requirements for doors, signals, brakes. Warmth appeared in those papers mostly as a maintenance duty. Watch the stove, keep the vestibule shut, prevent dangerous situations. And that detail matters. Heating was treated as part of operation, not emotional comfort, so passengers prepared themselves to endure, not to feel cozy. But as international tourism grew, the expectation of coziness began slipping quietly into the carriage, along with the tickets. At the same time, there was advertising and tourist culture, where winter was sold as an experience. Resort valleys, Davos, St. Moritz, and other high-season places promised clean air and snow that looked like health. In those descriptions, trains were the road to well-being, but hardly anyone in a brochure explained how people actually slept at night on the climbs, in wool, under a blanket, with a foot warmer, half dozing, waking to the squeal of brakes. And it was exactly that contrast between promise and reality that made passengers' memories so gripping. Complaints and everyday remarks usually hid not in grand chronicles, but in private letters and diary notes, in short phrases scribbled in the margins. We froze. The compartment is drafty. Warmed our hands at the station. They aren't always quotations that stand alone, but they form a repeating motif you can spot in any culture of long travel. People note what kept them from sleeping, and if you think about it, that's one of the most honest historical markers. Sleep quality as a measure of how home-like infrastructure had become. A carriage of that era wasn't a sealed room, but a compromise of wood, glass, and iron. Thin compartment walls, gaps in the floor, frames gone icy, frost on the inside. People describe all of it as discomfort and as background, like the sea's noise to a sailor. Passengers learned to build a small island around themselves. A blanket, a shawl, a fur collar, a suitcase by the feet as a barrier against drafts. And the better someone mastered that craft, the less they needed perfect heating, even though the dream of it never went away. The staff in this story stays almost invisible, yet decisive. Conductors, station attendants, workers on the platforms and along the line, you hear their work through wooden panels. Footsteps in the corridor, a door thump, tools clanking on the platform, a bucket of coal, a stove door opened for a second. Passengers rarely remembered a face, but they remembered the result. After a stop, the carriage came a little more alive with warmth, which meant you could sink back into sleep. And that may be the warmest historical truth of all. Someone else's labor becomes your sleep. Tunnels added their own acoustics and humidity to that sleep. Inside the mountain, the roar turned continuous. The air grew heavier. The blanket fabric felt damp to the touch, and the body reacted not to numbers, but to sensation. After leaving a tunnel, dry frost could even feel more comfortable because it was honest and predictable, while dampness was sticky and changeable. In that way, the train taught passengers to feel climate with the body. As an instrument, you can't fool with words. Technical progress gradually changed night trains. Better coach construction, tighter seals, improved heating and lighting, and on some lines, a growing role for electric traction. But in the first decades of the 20th century, that still didn't mean equal warmth for every compartment on every run. In the mountains, everything is decided by stops, wind, humidity swings, passenger density, door discipline, and the condition of stoves and connections. So, even an improved coach could suddenly turn icy the moment the train stood too long in hard frost. The most striking historical effect is how quickly people turned an unpredictable night into a set of behavior rules. Don't keep the door open. Don't rummage loudly for your things. Don't slam. Don't fight over the window. Put your suitcase by the draft. Protect the foot warmer. Keep your feet warm. Move less. These rules were rarely printed in big letters, but they traveled as road wisdom, and passengers started following them almost automatically. That's how an etiquette of winter sleep emerged, where politeness is measured not by words, but by minutes of warmth saved. That's why there's so much silence in memories of those journeys. People write about sounds, the wind whistling by a frame, the squeal of brakes, the jolts over snowed-in switches, the drone in a gallery and in a tunnel. But they write less about conversation, because conversation didn't solve the main task, and sometimes made it worse. Extra breath, extra humidity, extra movement. Silence became a practice, and in that silence, the train sounded like the only storyteller who never gets tired. On a wider view, those winter Alpine nights show how Europe entered modernity, not only through major construction projects, but through small, everyday adjustments. Gotthard, Simplon, the Lochberg line, and other projects shortened the route, but the habit of bringing a blanket and a foot warmer remained as important as the ticket. Tourism grew, resorts received guests, mail ran on schedule, and behind it all there was always the same simple scene. A person trying to warm their feet and close their eyes while wind howls just beyond the carriage wall. There is an astonishing amount of real history in that scene. Over time, trips like these began to feel like a rarity, almost a genre, because comfort in rail travel slowly became the norm, not a lucky break. But the memory of cold compartments clung on stubbornly. It latched onto frost on the glass, the feel of boards underfoot, the weight of a blanket, The hot foot warmer that first seems like a miracle and then cools anyway. Those details survive because they're physical, and the body remembers a journey differently than a calendar does. And if you've ever fallen asleep to the knock of wheels, you understand that language without translation. Sometimes it feels like the main lesson of that era isn't about hardship, but about learning how to make sleep possible where sleep seems impossible. In a cold coach, people learned to settle quickly, quietly, carefully, to save heat, not get angry at sounds, accept stops as part of the rhythm. And even if the train was delayed by snow, it became not a drama, but a long pause, where you could wrap up tighter and listen to the silence while people and machines worked outside. That isn't romanticizing the cold. It's a historical skill that made travel possible. And here is the last calm thought that lets stories like these drift you off. Those passengers didn't know their night blankets. Foot warmers and careful gestures would become part of the cultural memory of travel through the mountains. They simply did what worked. Shared warmth, protected silence, waited for the next wheel rhythm while frost drew its branches on the glass. And if you listen now, in the quiet, you can almost imagine that soft, stubborn sound. The train keeps moving forward, and that's exactly why you can allow yourself to close your eyes.